In 1623, a pregnant teenager inside the Forbidden City dragged herself across a stone courtyard during a thunderstorm to drink the dirty rainwater cascading off the roof tiles. She was surrounded by 9,000 rooms, thousands of servants, and enough stored grain to feed a province. She was starving to death. The space where she collapsed bore no plaque and no name. No building called the Lengong existed anywhere inside the Forbidden City. Not then, not in any dynasty before, not in the centuries after. The prison for rejected concubines was never a building. It was a sentence, an administrative status that could transform any room, any courtyard, any narrow gap between two walls into a tomb for the living. That teenager was not the first woman the Lengong consumed. It had been doing so for centuries, and one woman spent 30 years disappearing. In 1578, a young palace maid was assigned to serve an empress dowager inside the Forbidden City. She had no rank, no political connections, no name the court considered worth recording. The Ming dynasty's Wanli emperor, visiting his mother's chambers, briefly noticed her. Within weeks, she was pregnant. The emperor was so embarrassed by the liaison that he denied it entirely until his mother forced him to consult the imperial diary, where eunuchs logged every intimate encounter to the hour. The date matched. The denial collapsed, but acknowledgement did not follow. She gave birth to his eldest son, the single outcome the entire harem existed to produce, and received almost nothing for it. No meaningful promotion, no ceremony, no recognition from the man who was technically the most powerful person on earth. While the emperor lavished titles and attention on his favorite noble consort Zheng, the mother of the imperial heir was quietly relocated to the Jinyangong, a remote, deteriorating compound on the far eastern edge of the Forbidden City. Her name was Gongfei, and she would spend the next 30 years inside those walls. C. The Wanli emperor never issued a formal decree of punishment. He never stripped her rank publicly or ordered her confined. He simply stopped acknowledging that she or the palace she inhabited existed. The servants were reassigned, the supply allocations were quietly reduced, and the palace of great brilliance, its name suddenly ironic, decayed around her, while the central court conducted its banquets a quarter-mile away. She wept. For years, in rooms no one entered and no one maintained, she wept until untreated infections destroyed her eyesight entirely. By the time her son was finally permitted a brief visit to her deathbed in 1611, Gongfei was completely blind. She could not see the face of the child she had been forbidden from raising. She could only press her hands against his robes in the dark. The Palace of Great Brilliance was never formally designated a Lengong. After what happened inside it, the designation was already understood. Gongfei's fate was the quiet version neglect, dressed as indifference. Punishment administered through omission rather than decree. When the Lengong was formally activated, when an emperor or empress dowager actually issued a sentence of banishment, the machinery was deliberate and total. The process began with stripping. Court attire, jewelry, golden hairpins, every physical emblem of imperial rank was immediately confiscated. The condemned woman's personal entourage maids who dressed her, eunuchs who carried messages, attendants who were her only interface with the world beyond her courtyard was dismissed, reassigned, or eliminated entirely to guarantee silence. What remained was a woman alone in a room that the palace bureaucracy now treated as a liability rather than a residence. During the Qing dynasty, the imperial household department managed this erasure with administrative precision. The heavy wooden doors to the courtyard were locked, and the department's crossed paper seals were pasted across the frame, a bureaucratic stamp that made unauthorized entry a capital offense. Windows were boarded shut except for a single small opening, a so-called living window, just wide enough to slide a bowl through. That slot was the confined woman's last remaining connection to the outside world, and it was engineered to prevent conversation. Food came through. Words did not. The physical landscape reinforced the isolation. The central palaces of the Forbidden City were maintained by small armies of servants, vermilion pillars repainted each season, floors polished to a gleam, fresh orchids arranged on lacquered tables. The compounds designated for confinement received none of this. Lacquer peeled from the columns to reveal splitting gray wood beneath, and courtyards choked with weeds that no one was assigned to clear. The thick masonry walls, originally designed to contain fire, performed a secondary function with terrible efficiency. A woman screaming for water inside one of these peripheral compounds could not be heard on the central axis where the emperor resided. Think about what that means. Charcoal allocations, the difference between surviving a Beijing winter and freezing to death in one, were cut to nothing. The rations that passed through the window were calculated to sustain life at its barest threshold. Rancid rice? Wilted vegetables? No meat. The silence between deliveries was total broken twice each month when eunuch wardens arrived not to check on the woman's condition, but to administer scheduled humiliation. The former consort was forced to kneel on freezing stone and kowtow in gratitude for her continued punishment, while the men who had once bowed in her presence screamed insults from above. The most documented case, Zhenfei, confined behind sealed doors with these exact rituals of degradation until Cixi's eunuchs pulled her out and threw her down a well in 1900, is a story we've told in full. But the Qing dynasty, for all its calculated cruelty, was the most regulated iteration of this punishment across 2,000 years of imperial history. The dynasties that preceded it had no such bureaucratic guardrails, and without them, the architecture itself became the executioner. Now, the Qing court starved women slowly, behind officially documented seals. The earliest dynasties dispensed with the documentation. The oldest version of the Lengong was not a palace at all. During the Han Dynasty, disgraced women were confined in the Yongxiang, a series of narrow, high-walled corridors, originally designed as transit pathways within the palace complex, administered by a dedicated official whose sole responsibility was managing the women locked inside. Unlike the frozen silence of later centuries, the Han version paired spatial confinement with grueling physical labor. Women, whose bodies had known only fine silk, were forced to pound rice from dawn until dark, their hands blistered and bleeding on heavy wooden pestles. The most famous woman locked in the Yongxiang was Qi Furen, the deeply favored concubine of the founding emperor. She had spent years lobbying to replace the crown prince with her own son, a direct threat to the formidable Lü Hou. When the emperor died, Lü Hou seized absolute power and threw her rival into the alley to pound grain. Qi Furen sang a desperate lament while she worked, a song she hoped might reach her son's ears and bring rescue. The song reached Lü Hou instead. Her son was eliminated first. Then the woman herself was subjected to mutilations so extreme that court historians gave the result a single clinical name, 人质. When the empress forced her own son, the reigning young emperor, to view what remained, he suffered a psychological collapse so severe that he abandoned his imperial duties entirely. The Yongxiang had not merely imprisoned a woman, it had served as the staging ground for her annihilation. The Tang dynasty's most feared ruler found a method that required less spectacle. Wu Zetian locked two of her rivals, a deposed empress and a former consort, in a sealed room within the palace service bureau, their only contact with the outside world reduced to food passed through a hole in the door. When Emperor Gaozong visited the door and expressed a fleeting moment of pity for his former wives, Wu Zetian recognized the threat instantly. Within hours, both women had been beaten, brutalized, and submerged in vats of brewing wine. "Let these crones be drunk to the bone," she reportedly said. The sealed courtyard had been a temporary measure. The emperor's fleeting nostalgia made it a fatal one. A locked door meant nothing if the emperor still remembered who was behind it. The Ming dynasty's forbidden city, vast enough to house tens of thousands, was large enough to solve that problem. Its sprawling layout offered narrow, unroofed alleys between the high compound walls, gaps barely wide enough for a person to stand. During the reign of the Tianxi emperor, these gaps were weaponized by a dictatorial eunuch faction led by Wei Zhongxian and the emperor's wet nurse. They needed no executioner and no imperial death warrant. They sealed a woman behind the walls, ordered the kitchens to stop delivering food, and waited. The teenager drinking rainwater in the thunderstorm, her name was Zhang Yufei, and she was 17 years old. Her loyal servants had already been purged through forged imperial edicts, and the heavy doors at either end of the alley had been nailed shut. In the final stages of starvation, she dragged herself to the eaves during a downpour and pressed her face against the stone to drink the muddy water pouring off the roof tiles. Because no formal death warrant existed, and no blade had been drawn, the eunuch faction bore no direct legal responsibility for what happened to her. The walls had done the killing for them. One woman saw that death and understood exactly what it meant for her own future. Li Chengfei, another consort of the same emperor, had crossed the same eunuch faction by pleading for mercy on behalf of a fellow consort. She knew the retaliation would come, and she knew the method: the same sealed walls, the same absolute cutoff of food and water. What she did next has no parallel in the imperial record. Before her inevitable arrest, Li Chengfei secretly hid caches of dried food deep within the crevices and crumbling mortar gaps of the palace brickwork. When the doors were sealed and the delivery stopped, she rationed those hidden supplies for roughly 14 days, 2 weeks of silence behind locked walls, until the emperor casually remembered she existed and inquired after her. The eunuchs, bewildered that she was still breathing, demoted her to a palace maid and exiled her to one of the remote northern residences, rather than risk a second attempt. She outlived the regime. When the next emperor took power and purged the eunuch faction, he restored her rank and granted her a comfortable retirement. She is the only recorded woman who survived the Lengong by turning the architecture of her imprisonment into a weapon of her own. The typical fate was nothing like hers. For most women, the Lengong ended in slow, unrecorded death, untreated infections, starvation, or the quiet decision to stop waiting for the architecture to finish the work. Even the exceedingly rare survivors owed their lives not to the system's mercy but to its oversights. During the Song dynasty, Empress Mengshi was deposed on fabricated witchcraft charges, stripped of her titles, forced into a Taoist nun's robes, and banished to a temple outside the palace walls for 26 years. Then in 1127, the Jin army captured the capital during the Qing and used the imperial household registry to round up and enslave the entire royal court, every empress, every consort, every prince. Because Mengshi had been erased from that registry a quarter-century earlier, the invaders walked past her. She became the sole surviving member of the inner court, and went on to crown a new emperor and preserve the dynasty from total collapse. The punishment that was meant to erase her became the only reason she was still alive to save a dynasty. In palace dramas like Empresses in the Palace, the Lengong is a temporary narrative setback, a dusty, overgrown courtyard where the protagonist sharpens her strategy before staging a triumphant return to power. The historical record contains almost no such returns. The physical toll of malnutrition, frostbite, and untreated disease ensured that even when a regime change theoretically opened the door, the woman behind it was already gone. Here's the thing about the Lengong: it was not reserved for a handful of disgraced favorites. In 1707, Qing court records documented 129 low-ranking consorts confined simultaneously inside a single palace compound, the same palace of great brilliance, where Gongfei had spent 30 years weeping in the Wenjin. Dark a century earlier, these were not women punished for specific transgressions. They were women the system had used up and had nowhere else to put. The Lengong was the harem's disposal mechanism, the final destination for women who had failed to produce a son, outlived the emperor's interest, or simply aged past the threshold of political utility. The women who entered the Lengong were the ones who lost outmaneuvered by a rival, abandoned by an emperor, or erased by a system that generated far more women than it could ever use. But the women who avoided it never escaped the system that created it. They lived inside the other half of the same machine: the surveillance, the rationed charcoal, the nightly inspections that reduced intimacy to a bureaucratic transaction. The Lengong was the threat that kept everyone else compliant, and the palaces surrounding it were never as far from becoming one as the women inside them wanted to believe.